Thanks, John. So he gave you a little bit of what we do at Play Science. We really see ourselves as this bridge between the researcher and the designer and helping to create positive impact fun for kids and families. We also have another initiative, which is we just are in the process of opening our first Play Lab. The first one will be in New York, which is sort of research spaces for co-creating with kids, particularly around digital media. So our focus really is making sure that companies or organizations that are wanting to engage people in play have the resources and the platforms to do so. So that's what we do at Play Science. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you sort of 5 key things that we've seen when it comes to the family casual gaming space, sort of sets of information that are important, and then also talk about things we've learned about what it means to design for families. And when you're keeping families in mind, what are those design elements or processes that you should keep in mind so that you can reach a larger audience? Why would we want to do this? Money. I mean, okay, it's obviously good stuff too, but the reality is it's one thing to engage kids, and we know that we found a big market in the kids gaming space recently. It's quite another when you can reach their parents. That purse opens up just a little bit wider when you can get the families in there and get them engaged. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about understanding family values. Now, if you talk to parents, and particularly moms, but if you talk to parents, mom's got 2 rules, and this is actually for anything that they're going to buy. It could be food products, but we're definitely seeing this in digital media, and that is make my life easier and make my kids happy. Those are the 2 questions that come up. So when you start talking about casual games and creating games for kids or for families, you have to make sure that you're following this, and this can mean anything from what is your sign-in system, right? If that thing is not easy, forget it, right? She doesn't want to have to deal with it. If she has to come in, let's say you're creating a game for a preschooler, and she has to come in and help them set it up every time, right? Forget it. She doesn't want to do it. So make my life easier and make my kids happy. You know, the presentation you just had, you know, this idea that, hey, if you show me something that's kept my kid engaged for 30 minutes, gosh darn it, I am going to pay 99 cents for that, right? That's about making my kids happy. If I see that, I'm willing to pay for that content. And we've definitely seen that in the casual gaming space. So what provides value when it comes to the way sort of parents are seeing casual gaming? And again, this is for both kids and for families more generally. Learning and creativity definitely has a lot of value, and there's been a bit of a change over the past few years in the perceptions of value when it comes to learning, particularly a bit on the younger age group. We've seen a move from the traditional sort of ABCs and 1, 2, 3s to sort of, you know, sort of the things that Common Core standards and things like that, to much more interest in creativity. Right? Certainly like on the creativity apps, things that have more problem-solving skills, and their willingness to pay for things that are that kind of learning or creativity. If it provides together time, we know that parents like things for alone time. We know there's the pass back, please be quiet, I'm trying to drive in rush hour kind of thing going on. But there's also value in together time, right? Parents obviously want to be spending time with their kids, and if you give them something that's really fun for them to do as well, then that's a value that they're going to pay for. Replayability and reusability. I think that we're sort of over the initial, well, it's okay if they only played it a couple of times. Now parents actually want to see replayability before they buy something for their kids or for the family. It needs to be intuitive, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Having communication. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean having communication built into the game itself, but it means providing something that families can communicate around. And I'll talk a little bit later about sort of this idea that gaming can be a really great form of communication for families. Brands and characters have value, and parents will say that, you know what, I'm totally fine with having characters or brands that my kids don't necessarily know. On the other hand, the reality is if my kid is the one who's out there looking for the games to play, they're most likely going to pick up a character they like, right? So there is value in brand and character. It doesn't mean that you have to work with established IP, but it does mean that if you have a racing game and you have a NASCAR game, parents are more willing to pay for the NASCAR game than they are for the racing game, right? Because those brands add value. Now, there's also the argument those brands also add realism, which kids like in games and adults like in gaming as well. Multi-child use, this is a really big one, and this is both with regard to can multiple children in the household use it, right? Can my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old use it, or my 7-year-old and my 9-year-old? But also, is it designed so when I have multiple children using it, they both can use it separately, right? Things like separate logins, non-negotiable on the parent side, right? They don't want to have to log in separately or have, sort of separate apps or anything like that. They want to be able to have one system or one game that can be used by multiple kids. And then obviously safe and ad-free adds value for parents, right? Now, you also have a generation of parents who kind of is like, yeah, but if it's ads and it's free, great. But there is value still, and certainly for I'd say about 25% of parents, there's quite a bit of value in having it ad-free, and so they're definitely willing to pay for that. So the second thing to keep in mind is that families do want to play together, sometimes. Gaming has value for families in that 70% of parents think that playing with their kids on mobile devices actually helps their development, right? Part of this is, again, a new generation of parents who are seeing technology as being an important part of, the use of what their kids can do later on. 45% of parents, almost half, play computer or video games with their kids every single week, right? So we're talking about actually playing with their kids. That's up 36% in the past, from 36% in the past about 5 years. And then 84% of parents would be interested in playing asynchronous cooperative games with their kids. That may seem a little bit off, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but basically parents, if you think about asynchronous, we're not playing at the same time, we're cooperating, these are things that you're not really doing in gaming right now, certainly not in the family context. So parents are interested in new kinds of gaming. We're hearing them say, yeah, I like playing Angry Birds with my kids, I like, playing this particular game, Fruit Ninja, but I'm kind of ready for something new. There's like this desire to have good sort of gaming programming. And that's really how parents think of it, right? Because games are additive to the entertainment they already have. It's additive to primetime television and watching, but it's also sort of taking over some of that time that we're seeing that parents want something to do with their kids together. And another thing is, if we look at the way that parents and kids are playing together right now, and part of this is the way that we sort of developed casual games, right now they tend to be playing competitively. Right? Either I'm playing a game and I pass it to you and you're playing it and we're sort of competing against each other for high scores, or that within games they're sort of playing against each other, maybe in a racing game. But what's interesting to me is if you look at how parents want to be playing, and it may be a little bit hard to see, that's the green line, and this is, the top is on smartphone or iPod Touch, and the bottom is on tablet. They're really interested in also having opportunities for cooperative play. And that's not something we've done a lot in the casual gaming space, right? Is thinking about how can we make cooperative play something that's interesting. Now, part of that is because, obviously, it's parents and parents like kids to cooperate. Amazingly. But another is just that parents don't always want to be competing with their kids, right? Everyone's got a healthy sense of competition. This idea that, hey, it would be really nice if we could cooperate with each other to get something done is really, it's kind of what they do on other platforms or outside of platforms, so they want to be bringing that to the gaming space. The other thing is that kids want to spend time with their families, contrary to some of you who have kids who feel like your kids don't want to be spending time with you. When you ask kids what their number one thing to do if they had an extra hour in the day was, the first and second would be spending time with my friends in person and spending time with my family in person, right? That's the 1 and 2 things. Other things, playing video games comes, and watching television sort of comes next, playing games with their computer, but spending time with other people in my life, that's really what they're craving. And so when you could sort of aggregate these things and say, well, you can spend time with your family members and your friends and do it while playing casual games or whatever, huge win for kids. So one of the key things to think about is, if you're designing for together or you're designing for time alone. And you can do this within the same game, but you really do need to be thinking about sort of the space that you're fitting this in. So if you're designing for co-play, the key thing is you actually have to give them something to do together. A lot of people talk about, oh, this is a game for parents and kids, and the reality is it's kind of the parents looking over the kid's shoulder. There's not really anything engaging for the parent, or the parents doing something relatively menial, right? Like, oh, you can sort of set this game up for your kid and then they can play it. But if it's not fun for the parent side of it, then that's not a family game, right? That's a game that you've had the parent set up a kid's game. For a family game, it needs to be something the parent wants to do just as much, or maybe not just as much, but almost as much as the kid wants to do. So give them something to actually do together. But if you're designing it for the child, make sure that kid can do it alone. there really should not be a middle ground here, right? So the idea, and we work with a lot of game developers, when they're like, oh, the parents will teach them how to do that, right? Or, oh, don't worry about it, we've got instructions, the parents can read it. I mean, the reality is, A, they're probably not going to. The kid will have tapped in or gotten in and started the game anyway, and then if you try to take the mouse away or the tablet away, they're gonna start screaming. I mean, basically it has to be set up for the child to play by themselves if they're going to play by themselves. So as you're designing whatever you're designing, sort of make that decision as you're going in and design it accordingly. So when we think about where technology is in families and sort of this idea of it passing down and being passed back and being passed around within families, the first thing is that families over-index in every type of media. We have seen this with every technology that's come down from, the DVR, when the DVR came out, it was like, average households had, I think it was 18%. Families with kids had like 45% DVR, right? Parents figured out the library of their favorite Nick Jr. shows was a very good thing to have on their DVR to keep the kids quiet, right? So we've seen this as we've gone into tablets, into smartphones, certainly in computers with internet access. The technology is not a nice to have for families, and they will put resources to it. They think of technology as a very important thing for their kids to have as sort of a 21st century skill. So about 3/4 of US families right now have at least one smart device. That is tablet, smartphone, iPod Touch. It could also mean e-reader, things like the Kindle Fire. So some form of, it could be a Leapfrog, LeapPad, some form of sort of touch-based device. About 3/4 of US families have at least one of the smart devices in their home. And obviously, smartphones are the most likely. I'll show you some data on that in just a second. iPod Touches and tablets, and this data is about 6 months old, so these have increased. We saw a huge uptake. For example, Kindle Fire was huge with families, with kids over the holidays, right? It was sort of a low price point, hey, this can still play games kind of thing. Leapfrog, LeapPad has also done well. So this is not just about iOS, which I know a lot of people think about. This really is about sort of multiple opportunities for reaching these people across platforms. When we think about siblings are actually the #1 thing we see impact choice by a child for the games they want to play, right? As well as the platform. So if you have a platform that comes into a family, it's much more likely to be used by the older sibling. Let's use Leapfrog, the LeapPad as an example, than by the younger one. The second the younger one sees the older sibling doing something else, that whatever that product was kind of goes away. So the younger siblings age up, right? This is platform, this is also content, which makes a lot of sense. So again, going back to that multi-kid use, the more you can, when you sort of get your product, or your software, or your game, or your platform into the house and used by multiple kids at the same time, the better. The other thing we need to think about is dads. And as gamers and people who create games, this may not seem like such a surprise, but certainly as somebody who's worked with big media companies and marketers, the fact that we still think of purchase decisions as solely mom-oriented is crazy, and especially when you talk about gaming and you talk about technology. So we have this generation of dads in particular, but dads in general, more involved in family media, especially when it comes to purchase decisions. They're highly engaged in social media, and millennial dads have more friends in social media than millennial moms. Now, definition of friend, I don't know how close they are, but they have more friends in social media than moms. They spend more, right? So if you have mom spending 25 cents on an app, a dad's likely to spend 45 cents on that app. So almost double the amount that they're willing to spend on apps for their kids. And one of the really key things for us, certainly if you think about this from a marketing standpoint, or if you're reaching them, is they want to be spoken to as dads, right? So it's not just, hey, I'm a guy and whatever, and sort of my kids are hidden somewhere in some closet because I never see them in any advertising to me, whether that's about gaming or anything else. They really want to be spoken to as dads, right? So I think that keeping them in mind as we're not just both creating content, right? It's not just mom and kid playing the game, but also marketing, and I think that's really key. The fourth is that, surprisingly, money matters. So if we think about sort of the family gaming dollar, 91% of US kids 2 to 17 are gaming. That's up from 82% in 2009. right? So that's a massive increase, and this is, of course, across all platforms. The fastest growing segment right now is preschoolers. It's up 17% since 2009, so we're growing them early. We're getting them in there. We're moving it forward. Kids comprise 44% of new physical software dollars, right? We're also seeing, obviously, a big uptake in mobile. And then families right now are spending 5 times more on physical games than apps. Right? It's not really surprising when you consider maybe price points of apps, but we've got a lot of room to move across platforms for families in this. Now, I was recently at the Mama Bear conference, which is in San Francisco, which was sort of a startup conference, and the numbers that they're giving right now in family, in sort of the family and technology space, now this is not just like family games, this is across all platforms, and this is both, functional utility software and otherwise, is right now they're saying the families and tech space is about a $2.1 trillion market. So they're seeing this sort of move towards a much larger space that we haven't necessarily thought about in the past. And if we look at the economies of access and we think about sort of what families have access to, we're seeing a trend of things going bigger and a trend of things going smaller. So, getting bigger, the price of large screen TVs, it just continues to drop dramatically. It's crazy. 80% of TVs shipped by 2015 will be connected. Right now, it's about a third. Right, so that's an incredibly massive increase on the larger screens in the family room, which we traditionally think of when we think of family media. On the opposite end, we've now got obviously all the mobile stuff. 2/3, and this is the most recent Nielsen data, I think, from this past week, 2/3 of all phones purchased right now are smartphones. That's up from earlier this year when it was about 55%. So we're seeing, basically, we're moving towards most phones that are being purchased, and that's, as opposed to a feature phone, like a regular flip phone that can do texting and things like that. And tablet ownership is expected to increase by 200% across the US and Western Europe in the next 2 years, right? So this middle ground, right, the PC, it's not that that's going away, certainly, and there will always be a need for it, but we're really seeing trends going bigger and smaller. So when you're talking about families, they either want it mobile, take it with me, or I can and for kids, they're often not even taking it with them. The number one use for mobile by kids is in the living room, right? It's hey, it's being given to me. But it's really about going smaller and mobile, and it's going bigger and utilizing connected TV or console or something like that. Don't forget the grandparents. This is one of these things that, I love the grandparents. They're awesome, and they are incredibly powerful, and they are digital, and they love to game, right? So if the power of influence of grandparents in this generation, it's not just the sort of special times, it's day-to-day functioning of the family unit. This is the increase in 3-generation households. The orange line here is the increase from to 2020 of 3-generation households, right? So you're talking about when you have grandparents ages 55 to 64, about 15% of households are going to be 3-generation. 65 to 74, 16% of households in the US in 2020 are going to be 3-generation households, right? So we cannot, so that's actually living under the same roof. That's not just the fact that they happen to do daycare or be in the same town and take care of each other. The grandparent population is larger than either the African American or the Hispanic population. 3 in every 10 adults in the US is a grandparent. And they're not old when they're becoming grandparents, right? We're talking about 50 and 54 is the average ages. They control most of the money. Basically the point is, right, grandparents are super important when you're thinking about family gaming. It's not just who's in this immediate household. What do they want from technology? They want co-play, right? If I'm going to be with my grandchild, I'm not a pass this over to my grandkid, right? I want to be engaged in playing with my grandchild. That's the whole point of this for me. They want special and unique experiences. Hey, it would be great if I had something that I play with my grandkid that's different than maybe what they play with their parents, right? The same way they do with other types of play. They want more consistent communication. So using play as a form of communication between grandparents and grandkids. Hey, I did this, look at what I did. Hey, I did this, I'm thinking of you, right? A lot of that sort of keeping you top of mind. They want tangible gifts, even for digital items. It's still the case, right? I want something I can give to my grandchild. I don't just want to shoot them an email and say, hey, you got this, it's virtual, awesome, right? They like to still give tangible gifts. They want information and marketing that speaks to them, right? So whether it's that you put your information in the AARP magazine, or that it's a whole special website that's dedicated to grandparents, which is something that I think was Fisher-Price just did, they have sort of different and unique needs, and they want to be spoken to as grandparents. And they're also particularly interested in buying educational experiences. And even now you see in platforms like LeapPad or Leapfrog, that those that are explicitly educational are often purchased or more likely to be purchased by grandparents than things that are non-educational. They're the fastest adopters of new platforms. They're not the first adopters, but they tend to catch up very quickly, this new generation of grandparents. And you gotta remember that, play is not only for kids, right? That grandparents love this concept of play. They're doing it. We've certainly seen it in the casual gaming space with the boomer generation. So keeping in mind that they're wanting to play as well is important. So the last thing I just want to talk a little bit about, just sort of some key things to keep in mind when you're designing for families and bring back some of the things I've talked about earlier. So the first are the fundamentals of family game design. Accessible platform, and when we say accessible, we mean from 2 to 92, right? So keeping in mind, as part of the reason why tablets have been, we've seen such uptake in the family space, is that it's very simple, it's a very accessible platform, and accessibility is both about the platform and the interface itself, but also about sort of who has it, right? A user-friendly interface, and this is one of the, I don't say arguments, discussions I often get into with game developers, and I always say, look, if you have to explain it, it's wrong, right? If you're trying to explain what you're supposed to do, oh, no, that's not right, and this is to a 3-year-old, then you've done something incorrectly, right? You need to change, not your audience, because again, if you try to make a 3-year-old change, they're not going to, right? The other thing about this is that we found that, look, if you can design it for a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, then generally speaking, mom and dad can play it better too, right? This is something we've seen across the board, that if it's a really simple, intuitive interface for a kid, it's actually easier for mom and dad as well. So keeping in mind that younger age group, it's not just about designing for a young kid, it's about more like universal access if you're talking about sort of design in general. Have conscious inclusion of the family experience. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to design everything for families. By any means, it doesn't mean that single player is not super important. What it does mean is that, let's say you're designing Angry Birds, right? And you've got this killer, single person experience. Sit there and watch a family play Angry Birds, right? What often happens is I play, I pass it to you, you play. We compare scores verbally. Well, if I was looking at that, I'd say, why don't you create a really simple wrapper around that, right? That says, hey, you played, and then you played, and here are your scores. Look, we're actually doing what you're doing in real life. We're just kind of showing it to you. So it's not, again, that you have to necessarily be designing an entire game just for families. It's that keep the family in mind, especially if you're designing anything for kids. What could that look like? And it may be a parent, it may be another sibling, it could be their cousin someplace else, but if you just keep that as a use case, right, when we talk about designing with use cases, keep sort of that multi-user use case in mind. Think about the family as both nuclear and extended. So this is not just about who's in the household with them, but we have, again, generations that are sort of multi-generational, but then also we're seeing so much more communication across extended households. Kids often refer to their friends. Those are their cousins, right? But, oh, my best friends are but they're actually their cousins who live down the street or their cousins that live somewhere else. When Animal Crossing came out for the Wii, and I mean, this is anecdotal, but we heard so many kids talk about, oh, I love playing that game, and I love being, because they were obviously connecting with Animal Crossing, because I can play with my cousin in California, right? And this is somebody who may have been in Atlanta. So this idea that family for them is both nuclear and extended, and that social gaming for kids really does mean family gaming. Right? There's a lot of conversation about what does social gaming mean for kids? Is it social networks? You know what? If you start off with a fundamental assumption that the world of a child is their family and their immediate community, that really changes the scope of what you have to think about when you think about social games. So I think that's really important. So the future of family gaming, as we see it, it's multiplayer, right? But consciously multiplayer. Let me consider that either within the game itself or the experience itself, or as sort of a wraparound. It's both cooperative and it's competitive. It's not that competitive's not important, and gosh, those kids need to learn to lose, right? That's super important too. But why not have cooperative experiences? And parents really are looking for that, and grandparents as well. It should be both asynchronous and cross-platform synchronous. So cross-platform synchronous, keeping in mind here, I just mentioned the fact that for young kids, their most use is while they're sitting in the living room and somebody else might be on a different device somewhere else, the idea of why are we not playing on different devices at the same time? That is the reality of most households, let's say, particularly in the US today, right? We both have internet access on different things. Why can't we be playing on different computers or tablets or on a tablet and a computer at the same time? So we need to be thinking about cross-platform synchronous and then also asynchronous. This idea of going back to earlier when I said that parents, 84% of parents were interested in asynchronous cooperative play, right? So asynchronous meaning, hey, mom or dad's at work, they do something, kid comes home from school, they see what mom and dad did, that you're sort of playing all the time, right? In the way that we do a lot of this on social gaming or social network gaming. Why not? Parents want to communicate with their kids. They want to be constantly interacting with their kids. Why not make games that allow them to do that, to cooperate, to be doing stuff? They already do this, right? I mean, we have great stories of, back when Webkins was really big, the fact that, the kid would go off to camp and the mom would have to spend this time at camp, working with the Webkins so that the kid still had the points when the kid came back. I mean, you see parents wanting to engage with what their kids are doing, so why not sort of create systems that they're both enjoying that they can play all the time? And then a final thing is just remembering that for families, play is a form of communication. Parents are always looking for ways to interact with their kids. Play is one of the big ones, right? As you're developing your game, yes, it's about creating spaces to play together, but also, I was having a conversation over lunch with someone who's a writer. It's about creating narratives, right, that they want to talk about. It's creating characters that they want to talk about. So when you think about the experiences, just like we do if we talk about movies or we talk about television, there's such a rich world that we can create, and it doesn't have to be super complex, but that has multiple levels that families can talk about the play experiences. So I think that is really important. So one last note before I go, we're in the process of doing, we're going to be going into field in a few weeks in a multi-country casual gaming for families research study, a big survey. So if any of you guys have questions, please either come up to me, email me, Twitter us, whatever, because we'd love to make sure that we're getting the kind of information that you're interested in this family space as we go out into field in the study. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bryant, for that food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
So we did run right on the nose. I don't want to stop questions, though. Maybe if there's a couple of questions, we could take a couple, and then, yes, sir. If you could please speak into the mic, thank you.
So I heard earlier in the day about targeting developmentally appropriate content, 3, 5, and now you're talking about multi-child use. And I know there's a lot of gray area there, but I'm wondering if you can just give some examples of some games that have done that really well.
Of targeting multiple kids at the same time?
Yeah, at different developmental stages.
Yeah. Yeah, it's often about the ways that the kids use it separately, right? So it's the same way that, well, if you develop for television, you know this too, you can sort of develop the same scene on different levels. It's sort of like that, right? So you can create a game where, and I'm trying to come up with good examples right now in my head, so that's the reason I'm stalling. But you can create a game, for example, that a young child will use very simplistically and an older child will use in a more complex way, or let's say you have rewards, right? A 3-year-old's not necessarily going to get a reward, but they're going to get the fun part of it, whereas a 5-year-old's going to understand more the complexity of the rewards. Okay, so to give you an example, when I was still, I used to work at Nickelodeon, and we were developing some of the Wii games for Dora and Diego, right? They were based for families. There were sort of multiple levels built into those, so you could just be like playing with the Wii and running around like a crazy person and winning in your mind. But if you were an older kid, you could actually go in and be trying to get goals, right? Or playing with somebody else and sort of having a different experience. So yes, a 3- and a 5-year-old are different, but you can create something for a 5-year-old that a 3-year-old can kind of play around with and still have a good time. Some of that's just about very basic feedback, right? You won. They see something big, they have no idea what it says, and in fact, that's one of the things we saw in Nintendo, the Wii Sports, is that it gets really big and it says you lose. But the kids, it was just something big and flashy, they thought they won, so they were just cheering every time, right? So it doesn't even, it can be kind of broad speaking, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Allison. Oh, hang on, let me bring you a microphone.
I was going to ask a similar question to yours, but for examples of great games for like a K through 3 crowd where it invites co-play.
Yeah.
And is browser-based or an app?
And browser, right, and browser-based or an app. No, I think it's a great question. I think that, although this is a little bit younger, the stuff that Tokaboka has been doing that's a little more open, I think is a great example of being able to have multiplayer, and it can be used across all different age groups. That's one that we see they really, really love. So I think that's a good example of something that can be used sort of across ages, and can be used also very differently, depending on how you're doing. If you look at the beauty shop or barber shop that they have, a 3-year-old uses that very differently from a 6-year-old, uses it differently from their parent. So I think that suite of apps I think is really good. And trying to think, browsers. I mean, some of the they weren't necessarily developed for them, but some of the games like an Angry Birds or a Fruit Ninja or Where's My Water, or, you know, those things have done well across a broad age group because kids play them differently. They weren't necessarily created for them, but there's sort of multiple types or multiple levels of gameplay that you can do, even, you know, as you're leveling up or not. So I think those are good examples. But I do think that more cognizant development of those kinds of games could see massive financial success, right? You see some games that do that being super successful. So I think the more that we sort of focus on that, or at least keep it in mind as we're developing, you're going to see much higher numbers and sales on those. And again, if a parent sees it and they're like, oh, I want to play that, and my kid's playing it, they will pay money for it, and they'll pay good money for it. Like, we're not talking about 99 cents. We're talking about, ooh, $2.99, right? Or even $4.99. If you get multiple people in the household, they're more willing to pay for it, right? So I think that's sort of the goal, is to create these sustainable games that can be reaching families as opposed to just focusing on kids or just focusing on parents.
That I think Minecraft is a good example of something that extends out, not only to younger and, you know, kids who are 10, but also up to adults, obviously, as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example of Minecraft.
All right. Well, thank you, Alison BRYANT.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.